Hey y'all, it's entry number 29 of this offseason series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Derrick Henry, running back, Tennessee Titans. We'll start with some of the positives from Derrick Henry's fantasy profile. To start, we gotta talk about how Derrick Henry puts the team on his back though. Derrick Henry is the engine that makes the Titans offense go, and they know it. In each of the last 3 seasons, Derrick Henry has averaged over 21 touches per game, with 21.4 touches per game in 2019, 24.8 touches per game in 2020, and 29.6 touches per game in 2021, according to Pro Football Reference. You won't find many players that are capable of seeing this large amount of touches per game, and that makes Henry a more intriguing investment. The next positive with Derrick Henry's fantasy profile is his past fantasy dominance. It cannot be understated how dominant Derrick Henry has been in the fantasy football world over the last 3 seasons. In 2021, he finished first in standard with 21.9 points per game, half PPR with 23.0 fantasy points per game, and PPR formats with 24.2 fantasy points per game in terms of fantasy points per game. During the 2020 season, in terms of total fantasy points, Derrick Henry was the RB1 in standard with 314.1 total fantasy points and 19.6 fantasy points per game, the RB2 in half PPR format with 323.6 total fantasy points and 20.2 fantasy points per game, and the RB3 in full PPR formats with 333.1 total fantasy points and 20.8 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2019 season, Henry finished as the RB2 in standard with 276.6 total fantasy points and 18.4 fantasy points per game, RB3 in half PPR formats with 285.6 total fantasy points and 19.0 fantasy points per game, and the RB5 in full PPR formats with 294.6 total fantasy points and 19.6 fantasy points per game in terms of total fantasy points, according to Fantasy Pros. He's been a top 5 back as long as he's playing, regardless of format, the last 3 years, and there aren't many backs that are capable of performing at that level. The last major positive with Derrick Henry's fantasy profile is the evaded tackles and overall rushing talent. During the 2021 NFL season, Derrick Henry finished 3rd in evaded tackles among running backs with 92, according to Player Profiler, despite only playing in 8 games. The 250-pound running back was also number 1 in breakaway runs with 21, evaded tackles with 112, and yards created with 997 during the 2020 season, according to Player Profiler. He's clearly one of the most, if not the most, talented pure runner in the league. Moving on to some of the concerns with Derrick Henry's fantasy profile. To start, we're going to talk about last season's injury and his past workload possibly catching up to him. Derrick Henry had a nasty foot fracture, a Jones fracture, that caused him to miss the final 9 weeks of the regular season. He's only played in 1 game since the injury, a playoff game against the Cincinnati Bengals where Henry carried the ball 20 times for just 62 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Given this injury, as well as the fact that Derrick Henry is now 28 years old and around the running back age cliff now, it's reasonable to question if he is going to look like the dominant player that he's been in the past during the 2022 season. The next major concern with Derrick Henry's fantasy profile is his receiving workload. While Derrick Henry did see more usage in the passing game on a per-game basis during the 2021 season, where he had 18 receptions on 20 targets for 154 receiving yards in 8 games, this is still not his strong suit. Over the course of his 86-game regular season career, Henry has caught just 94 passes on 125 targets for 846 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. On a per-game basis, this is just 1.09 receptions on 1.45 targets for 9.84 receiving yards and 0.03 receiving touchdowns per game, according to Pro Football Reference. He still has yet to technically have over 20 receptions in a season, and compared to other players going around his ADP, he seems more limited in the receiving department. The last major concern with Derrick Henry's fantasy profile is the projected subpar offensive line. The Tennessee Titans offensive line finished as the 16th best offensive line in the league last year, according to Pro Football Focus. The team is projected to bring back 3 of the 5 starters from last year's line, and going into the 2022 season, the Tennessee Titans offensive line is projected to be the 27th best in the league, according to Pro Football Focus. Some additional thoughts on Derrick Henry. During the 2021 season, in half PPR formats, Derrick Henry had 0 out of 8 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 2 out of 8 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 0 out of 8 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 8 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 8 games with 20 to 30 fantasy points, and 3 out of 8 games with over 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Titans offensive coordinator Todd Downing has done a solid job of utilizing his running backs over the 2 years that he's been an offensive coordinator with the Raiders and the Titans. Personal opinion: Derrick Henry is going off the board as RB4, about pick 6 overall on ESPN, and RB3, about pick 4 overall on Yahoo. He's definitely shown one of the highest ceilings in all of fantasy, but he's also probably got one of the lowest floors of the top 5 to 6 running backs with his projected poor offensive line, subpar receiving usage, and his age and previous heavy workloads potentially catching up to him. I'm slightly lower on him than the general consensus because of the age, previous workloads, and the offensive line risks relative to some of the other top backs this year, but I am still planning on ranking him as the RB5 or RB6 because of the high ceiling he's shown in the past. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Derrick Henry's My Cause, My Cleats in 2021 was for the 2 All Foundation, which exists to level the playing field for today's youth so that their future success is not limited by the circumstances of their upbringing, background, disability, or influence. Here's the link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.